Hi everybody, my name is Justin Maas and I'm a portrait artist from British Columbia, Canada. Today we're going to be doing a full color portrait using these great pencils from Lyra. The line is called the Rembrandt Polycolor Pencils, and they're actually an oil-based pencil, which is a little different than what you might be used to with wax pencils. They're great for layering, for keeping your pencil really sharp, and they're just a really neat pencil to work with. So we're going to be using those. We're going to be also working on this Bristol, which is Strathmore paper, 500 series Bristol. I'm using the plate version, which is actually the smooth version. There is a vellum as well, which you may prefer, but I like working smooth, especially with these pencils because they do sharpen really nice and sharp. So yeah, well, let's head over to the drawing board and we'll get started and see where we go from there.
So the very first thing I do when I start a drawing is I begin by kind of getting an idea of where I want it on the page, okay? Very, very lightly. I'm using a really light gray pencil, almost to the point where you can't see it, but you're kind of seeing me work out where some of the pieces need to be. And at this point, it's more about just me getting a sense of how I want to see those elements on the page, okay? And as I start to work out, you know, the line for the eyes, the area of the neck, that kind of stuff, then I'm prepared to move on to a darker pencil. So now I'm switching to a light brown, and you can see that I'm starting to put in some more of the features. My big goal here is working with the angles. So the angle of the jaw, the angle of the eyes, kind of working out the height of the face, where the nose is, where the eyes are, all that kind of stuff. Because when it comes to portraiture, the most important thing is the placement of the features, not the features themselves. You can get an eye slightly wrong, but if it's in the wrong place, it won't look like the person, okay? So now that I've got kind of an overall feel, and it's very, very light, right? Because I don't want to have to keep erasing. Now I'm starting to fill in some more details. The most important thing here is to be sure that you're using a pencil that'll work with the rest of the medium that you're using. In this case, we're using these Rembrandt Polycolor Lyra pencils, so that's what I'm using to block in. Sometimes I see people use a graphite or something else, or charcoal or something, but often your media that you're going on over top of it with will not work together. So what I'm doing is just using a series of different Rembrandt Polycolor pencils, which can then be built on with other ones, okay? So again, the real key is keeping it nice and light, okay? And just starting to get those things in place. So you can see that I figured out the size of her nose, the distance between the nose and the mouth, the angles of the jaw, all of that kind of stuff. And now I'm just very, very lightly starting to build it all in. We're speeding this up by about 300% just so that the video doesn't take super, super long. But all in all, this is probably about 25 to 30 minutes of block in this part of the video. You can see that I'm still keeping things very, very light. This is a lovely paper, this Bristol. It will handle a lot of layers, but the one thing you don't want to do is erase a lot. So by keeping things light, even if I get things in the wrong place, it's okay because I can go over them. So now you can see I'm starting to add a little bit more pressure. You can start to see things a little bit better, right? The actual shapes are starting to take place, and I'm starting to kind of key in on some of those overall shapes, not just the features of the face, which obviously are crucial, but also things like the curve of her cheekbones, the angle of the area around the mouth, that kind of stuff. Now I'm pretty much done the blocking at this stage, so I'm ready to switch to a darker pencil, which is what I'm using here, a kind of a darker brown or a sepia, and actually start to hone in on some of those shapes, so locking in areas. I still don't want to go too dark, okay? The thing about when you work with an oil-based pencil like this is you really want to do some layering. You don't want to go too fast, even though I know the eyes are going to be very dark, and certain areas like the nostrils and that are going to be the darkest parts of the drawing. I want to still layer because you never know when you're going to change your mind or if you need to adjust something. Overall, I think that the drawing looks pretty accurate, but there still might be, you know, a tiny adjustment needed. And so if we don't go too dark, then there's always the chance of being able to fix things. I'm starting to, you know, sort of reinforce the lines that I've already put down and add in a little bit of detail, but by and large, I'm getting to the point where I feel like the block end is just about done. So I'm ready to nearly move on to starting to put in values. But at this stage, we want to just make sure that everything's right. So there's a lot of kind of checks and balances. You know, don't be afraid to use some kind of a measurement tool, a ruler, or a proportional divider or something like that if it helps you. I'm mostly just measuring with my eyes, but I'm starting to really lock in these sharp edges and really kind of get a sense of where I want all of these different planes. That's really the key when you're drawing a face. It's not just about, you know, the nose, the eyes, and the mouth. There's also all of the other planes. And as you can see here, I'm starting to build in those neat little highlights that she has on her cheek, because that's going to give a bit of visual interest to this portrait. It's going to be kind of one of the focal points as well as her eyes. Okay, so I'm still using that same like sepia or dark brown pencil, but you can see there the lines are getting darker, and that means that I'm using more pressure. But yeah, overall I think that the block end's pretty much done, and now we're starting to add values. Now, one of the things you may notice is that I'm not really rushing in to, you know, add in specific pinks and, you know, beiges and all the sort of standard flesh colors that we think about. What I'm mostly concerned about at this point is values, so the lights and the darks of the face. If you look at your hand or any part of the skin that you can see in front of you, you'll see that there are all kinds of different colors. And so you're going to see me using things like blues and pinks and greens and things like that. So at this stage, I'm more interested in building up those layers and creating form, and then we layer the colors over top. And you see that there's a number of different ways to build up color. You could take, you know, there's actually in this set there's a pencil that's called Flesh. You could take that and apply lots of pressure and burnish an area and make it dark, but it won't have a lot of vibrancy. And by working the way that I'm doing here, where we add in layers and we start to build up those values and build up the form, we actually create a much more lifelike portrait, and we want to breathe life into the portrait. Okay, so here I am just adding in some darks. I'm mostly switching between different types of browns and lighter colors, but there's also a little bit of blue being added in. There's a bit of pink. And I decided to zoom in a little bit here so you can see me starting to add a little bit more detail. So now I'm bringing in, that's still not black. It's like a sepia or something like that. So, but you can see how much more vibrant it gets as you start to build in those colors, right? If you were to scroll back a couple of minutes here in the video, you would see that things were starting to look somewhat dark. But once I added in that dark in the eye, it's considerably darker, and that's how values work. As I build up here, I'm paying special attention to the lights. There is a white colored pencil in this set, but white colored pencil really doesn't work that well under any circumstances. It's just not a super vibrant color. So whenever you have areas that you want to leave white, like the highlights on her nose and things like that, we want to try and reserve the paper. And that means we're going to let the paper show through in those areas, okay? So you can see as I start to build in the eyes and the planes around the eyes that we're starting to get some form happening, right? And that's something that really is the goal with this, because, you know, likeness is based on where things are in terms of feature placement and things like that, but it's also very crucial to get the form of the face right. As I start to build up those layers, you can see that I've left some areas like the nose and that little highlight on the edge of the face. All of that is left white so that it continues to be nice and bright, and very, very subtle amounts of color in certain places. So some places like the nostrils here, you can see, or around the eyes there, I'm actually applying a fair amount of pressure, but then on other areas like the side of her nose, I've only added a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to zoom out now just so that we can get a slightly better view of the overall picture. When you're zoomed in, you can get more details, but sometimes you don't get to see exactly what's happening. So I'm building up the planes in the lips here, okay, and you can see the drawing starting to come together fairly nicely. There's a lot of values that still need to be added, and at this stage we're probably only about a third of the way into the drawing, but a lot of the really heavy lifting has been done because we've got the things in the right place, right? If you think about the block like building a house, it's like the foundation of the house. Once you have that ready, the rendering, you know, it takes a lot of work and it takes practice to get good at it. but it's really following along with that same plan. So you want to definitely make sure that it's not just the face that you're working on. So I'm starting to add in values in the hair, and I'm starting to add in values in the neck. And all of that is useful because we need to know just how dark to go in certain places of the face. So I'm also kind of trying to pay attention to the fact that, like, if you look at the reference, the really interesting part about that is the half of the face is very, very bright and the other half is quite dark. So we want to play those two off of each other. So obviously I have a lot of build-up values that needs to be done on the left side, so the model's right side of the face. And you know, one of the things you'll notice as you watch me do this video is I'm constantly switching back between different areas of the face, because I'm not what I would consider to be a photorealist, right? I draw realistically. There's an element of realism in what I do. But because I'm not a photorealist, I like to actually build up the whole thing at once. So you see that as I add in the black, and I'm using a Splenda, which is the blender that Lyra makes. It's a lovely little colorless blender, and actually using a bit of a tortillon. But you can see as I add in the blacks here, it gets much, much richer. You notice there that I was using an eraser. I've used an eraser a couple of times in here. Helps me to keep the areas that are light clean, which is important, and also it allows me to bring out those highlights. So I use both a click eraser and an electric eraser. They both work really well. The key here is having a good quality paper. This Strathmore 500 series Bristol is about as good as it gets. I don't know that there's any paper that's better, and it holds up really well to things like that. Now I'm just starting to add in a little bit of warm color, okay? Because we don't want it to be we don't want all those shadows to be dull. We want to sort of bring in darks, but we also want to bring in some warmth. So there's varying levels of darkness, and there's also varying levels of warmth and coolness. And those are all kind of considerations that you have to make as you build up these layers. And the eyebrows I was leaving because I wanted to kind of get the skin tones under the eyebrows a little bit better. So I've pulled out my color wheel and I've picked a color that's pretty close to the overall feel of the portrait. And if I go on the exact opposite, I get a kind of a neutral purpley sort of color. And that's what we're going to use for the background. You could certainly use an analogous color, so an orange or a tan or a beige or something like that, but by going with the complement, we get something that works quite nicely with the flesh tones of the portrait, which are obviously the primary tones of this drawing. So I'm starting off with a kind of a mid purple, but I'm actually, in my head, I'm intending to add in some gray as well. So I'm kind of mixing the two. I've got a purple, I've got a gray. I'm now adding in just a little bit around that hairline, just because as you start building, you know, you'll notice I jump around a lot because I see things as I'm going and I go, okay, I should do that a bit more. So now back to the background. It takes a while, obviously, to build this stuff up. But as I build, I now am obviously working around the background, so I want to make sure that the hair is filled in. So it's a constant kind of back and forth between the edges that touch the background, in this case the hair, and the background itself. And yeah, I said it's really kind of just building those up. I'm taking a tortillon and blending a little bit just to help me to kind of smooth out, because this takes a while, right? We've sped this video up, obviously, so that you're not sitting here watching it in real time, but you're probably looking at maybe half an hour or longer just to lay down that color in the background. You know, large areas of color, that's the one kind of downside with colored pencil. Here I'm kind of going over the purple with a neutral because I don't want it to be too bright, right? I don't want it to be kind of jarring and too purpley. But by putting down that purple base and then going over it with the gray, we get something that works quite nicely with the skin tones. And I want kind of a muted portrait, right? I mean, one of the things that appealed to me about the reference was the way that there were these interesting sort of shapes and colors in the skin in the shadows. That's kind of what we're going with here. And obviously I'm adding in a little bit of the edging on her shoulder and things like that. None of this is quite ready yet, but we're kind of getting everything in order before we start in with really kind of finishing off that background. So I have taped down my piece, but I am going to have to kind of loosen it up so that I can get to the edges. So I'm going to take the tape off now, and I'm going to turn the paper just so that I can get into some of those areas. Don't be afraid to flip your paper, move it around, whatever is most comfortable for you. So as you can see here, I'm slowly starting to darken areas, but as you can see in the lips here, I'm starting to introduce some color. Very subtle color, but we build these up with these oil-based pencils. One of the beautiful things about them is that you can really kind of get a lot of really interesting detailing. So I'm going to slow this part down a little bit. You can see as I add in a little bit of Indian red here, it just brings out that little bit of color, right? And it makes those skin tones more natural. Sometimes there's a tendency when we draw skin to make things a little bit garish, but with these pencils, because you can layer so nicely, because they're a really kind of a sharp sort of fine point, you can get a lot of really rich colors. My studio lights are not ideal for showing off the colors. At the end of the video, you'll see the final piece, and you can see how some of these colors that are a little bit more muted in the video do really come out when you take a proper photograph of it. But you can see I'm just adding in ever so slightly using a minimal amount of pressure, and you can see I'm starting to get some really nice defined areas, and that really brings out the features and therefore the likeness of the model. I'm just continuing on with that same sort of idea here, darkening up areas, adding in a little bit more in the way of details. It's just a build-up sort of process that gets you the tones and the values that you want. And the really nice thing about these oil-based pencils is that there's a number of different ways that you can blend with them. So you can do like I am here, where you're basically just blending with the pencils, using one layer on top of the other. Or like I'm doing here, you can use a colorless blender. So the Lyra version is called the Splendor, which is basically just a stick of the polycolor pencil without pigment. So that's really nice, allows you to blend it. You can also use a tortillon. So lots of different ways to bring out those values, to kind of get different colors, different levels of intensity, and different levels of contrast and details and what have you. And it's all really part of the goal. Now, again, because the white in most color pencils, and this is no different, is not a super intense white. One of the best things you can do is try and use the intensity of the paper. So I'm just going to slow this part of the video down here. I'm going to pull out an eraser. Here I'm using an electric eraser. You can use a kneaded eraser or a little click eraser or whatever, but I'm actually pulling out that white tone. So it's imperative that you use a good quality paper like the Strathmore 500 series Bristol that we're using here, because it'll allow you to erase that pigment and still really get the strong bright white from the paper. So we're going to speed it right back up again. We're just getting sort of towards the end of the video here, and I'm just kind of adding in those final bits of contrast. You can see that things are starting to really come together nicely here. We're getting the area on the cheek where I had that really nice shadow and highlight that I mentioned at the very beginning that I wanted to bring out. I think that's there. And we've also really got a nice focal point happening with the eyes, right? I've put a lot more detail, a lot more contrast into the eyes, and that's a real portraitist trick to kind of getting that focal point, honing us in on the eyes, to put your strongest contrast there and to sort of soften out some other areas, and I think that's worked well here. So overall, I'm pretty happy with where the piece is going. And as I said, you know, these pencils are great to work with. If you're familiar with other colored pencils and you've never tried these, I certainly recommend them. They're one of my favorites when I do work in color. They do allow a lot of interesting variation in color, and they're great for detail work, which, you know, as a portraitist, that's something that I really do like. And so I'm just about ready to wrap up here. I'm just kind of putting some of the finishing touches, doing a little bit more detail work, but I'm going to take a proper picture with the right lighting. And this is the final piece done in Lyra Rembrandt Polycolor Pencils on Strathmore Bristol paper. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. It was a lot of fun. And as I said, I strongly recommend working with these pencils if you've never tried them before. The paper obviously is one of my favorites. So thanks again for watching, and I hope everybody's going to have a great day. Keep those pencils sharp.